Ik mag het eigenlijk niet zeggen, maar ik ga het toch doen. Hopelijk hebben jullie er zin in. En daar willen we het met de volgende spreker eigenlijk graag over hebben, want dat woordje hoop, dat wordt meestal opgehemeld als iets dat in alle opzichten goed is. Zolang we de hoop maar niet verliezen, hoor je wel eens vaker. De Stoïcijnen echter, het mag u niet verbazen, wantrouwen hoop en vinden dat je het zoveel mogelijk moet vermijden. En om dat te duiden hebben we de geknipte persoon voor jullie gevonden. En dat is niemand minder dan John Sellars. Hij is een internationaal gewaardeerde expert in de filosofie van de oudheid en de Hellenistische filosofie meer in het bijzonder. Hij doceert aan de Universiteit van Londen, is verbonden aan het King's College in Londen en het Wollaston College in Oxford. Hij is een auteur van een steeds langer wordende lijst impressionante boeken, de meeste daarvan over de Stoa. Echte aanraders dus. So, John, I will leave control to you. A very stoic thing to say. I'm very sorry that you didn't fully comprehend my introduction in our Dutch language, but you'll have to take my word for it that I only said kind things about you and always with the best intentions.
That's great, thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. So I trust you can all see that okay. So thanks everyone for tuning in. So I'm going to talk about Stoics against hope. I'm going to try to convince you of the idea that from a Stoic perspective, hope is a bad thing that we ought not to try to hold on to. So what I want to do is just say a little bit about 5 points, which together will hopefully add up to something that will enable me to make the case that I want to make about hope. So I want to talk a bit about character, about dealing with difficult situations, some examples from Seneca and Epictetus, and then a bit about emotions or passions. So let's start with some core Stoic ideas. Absolutely central to thinking about Stoicism is thinking about what's important, thinking about what has value, what's worth pursuing, what's really good. And as many of you will know already, the one thing, the only thing that the Stoics think is genuinely good is an excellent, virtuous character. That's the only thing that the Stoics think is truly good, because having a virtuous character will consistently benefit us, they say. So no matter what the situation you find yourself in, no matter what's happening, no matter what the circumstances, if you've got the right excellent character traits, you're always going to benefit from having those. They're never going to cause you any difficulty, right? So that's the key reason why the Stoics think that virtue is the most valuable thing. And of course, there are all sorts of other things that we regularly value in our daily lives, all those external things like money, health, success, good reputation, all of these sorts of things that, of course, the Stoics will say are not genuinely good, even though they are, in fact, even though they are what we might call preferable, right? So they're all things that we would like to have. All other things being equal, we'd much rather have these things rather than their opposites. And the Stoics think that it's perfectly natural for us to want to pursue these things, because these are all things that contribute to our preservation as physical beings, right? Health is important for your preservation. Money, success, these sorts of things enable you to flourish as a physical being. But the Stoics are going to want to resist saying that any of those things are genuinely good, because they don't consistently benefit us in the way that virtue does, right? So it's possible to be fit and healthy and rich and successful, and yet still thoroughly miserable and dissatisfied and unhappy and discontent with life, right? So you can have all of those things and still not be living a good life. they don't always benefit us. And the Stoics are going to want to say that whether those sorts of things benefit us or not is ultimately going to depend on our character, on whether we have that excellent virtuous character, right? So if you've got the right character, then you can make good use of your health and prosperity, and you can truly benefit from those things because you know how to use them well. But if you don't know how to use them well, no matter how much of those external things you have, you're not going to really benefit from them, right? So these are the kind of the philosophical arguments why the Stoics think that it's virtue that's the one thing that we really ought to focus our attention on securing above all else, because that's the one thing that is necessary and sufficient for us to be able to live a really good life. So that's the kind of first core idea I want to put on the table, this idea that the thing that really has value and that really matters is something internal rather than anything external. Now, another central theme that we find in Stoicism is a series of strategies to help us cope with adversity. Now, if, as I've just been suggesting, it's having an excellent virtuous character that is the one thing that really matters, that's the one thing that's really valuable. If that's the one thing we need, then one of the consequences of that thought is that external events and circumstances and situations that we might find ourselves in during the course of our lives are going to be somewhat less important, right? These aren't the things that are essential in order for us to live well. The big Stoic claim, of course, is that you can live a good life, a happy, fulfilled, satisfied life, if you've got that excellent character, no matter be. And one of the ways in which the Stoics try to encourage us to really digest that idea is for us to reflect on different situations that we might encounter in the future and think about what's the worst that could happen in any given situation in the future. So if you're planning in advance for an event, don't merely think about what you would like to happen, what you're aiming at, but also think through and reflect on all the other possible outcomes that could take place, right? And in particular, consider how you would respond if absolutely everything went wrong. What would you do if that happened? And this, the Stoics famously call a kind of preparation for future evils. So before heading into any kind of an event, think through what's the worst that could happen in this situation? And if the worst came to pass, what would I do? How would I respond? What would be my immediate reaction to that? And not only that, you might go a bit further and you might say, okay, if this situation turned really badly against what it is that I would like to happen, what would I do in response? What would be my plan B if plan A falls apart? And this is part of a kind of sort of preparation for different situations we might find ourselves in that the Stoics encourage us to do as a way of coping and dealing with difficult situations that might happen in the future. And the Stoics think that there are two significant benefits from engaging in this kind of reflection on external situations. The first is this: let's say the situation turns out well, things go exactly as you would like them to go, right? Now, rather than merely unthinkingly assuming that things were going to go your way, because you've gone through this process of reflection in advance and thought about the various ways in which things might have gone wrong, when things do turn out well, you're going to be all the more grateful and appreciative. You're going to be able to value that positive outcome much better than if you'd have just unthinkingly gone through the process. And one of the reasons, of course, why you're going to be that much more grateful is because you're fully aware of all of the possible alternative, much worse outcomes that could have taken place because you've reflected on them. So if things go well, you're going to respond much better. If things go badly, you're also going to be much better prepared in a couple of ways. So having gone through this process of reflection in advance, if things do turn out in a way that you would prefer not, you're not going to be hit so hard emotionally. You're not going to be hit out of the blue by that negative situation because you've already contemplated that as a real possibility. And if you have genuinely taken some time out to think what your plan B might be, then not only are you not going to be knocked sideways emotionally by this difficult situation, but you're also already going to have a sense of, okay, this is what I'm now going to do, given things haven't worked out the way that I would have liked them to do. So rather than having a really negative emotional response to this difficult set of circumstances, you can just immediately, calmly, just initiate plan B. Okay, this is what I need to do now that this has happened. So the Stoics think that by reflecting on situations that we're going into in this way, we can prepare ourselves so that we can cope with whatever circumstances or situations we find ourselves in. And of course, developing a virtuous character is going to give us the appropriate traits that we need to engage in that kind of process of reflection really effectively. Now, Seneca picks up on these ideas in a really nice essay of his entitled On Providence, in which he reflects about the role of good and bad luck in our lives. And one of the things that Seneca does in this essay on Providence is he argues that much of what we might ordinarily think of as bad luck may in fact benefit us. And we should think of bad luck, difficult situations that we might find ourselves in, as a kind of a training exercise that will enable us to develop the virtues, to develop those good character traits that we need. So we might colloquially in English describe a really difficult set of circumstances as character building. And Seneca wants to take that phrase quite literally, right? If you suffer through some difficult adversity, this is going to build your character. You're only going to develop the courage of virtue, the virtue of courage, for instance, if you're put in really testing, difficult circumstances in which courage is required, right? So Seneca thinks we should see difficult situations as if there's something that will in fact benefit us. Now, some people might be skeptical of adopting that kind of attitude. But one point that Seneca is going to want to make is that even if you decide not to adopt that attitude, you're still going to experience the bad luck, right? If bad luck comes along, you're going to experience it one way or the other. But of course, if you don't adopt this attitude that Seneca is suggesting to treat bad luck as a training exercise, then you just treat it as bad luck and you're going to be miserable. So if you find yourself in a difficult situation, you've got a choice, right? You can either choose to see it as something negative and be miserable, or you can see it as a situation that you can benefit from insofar as it will enable you to develop virtues such as courage, resilience, patience, and so on. So that's the choice we've got. We can either see bad luck as a source of misery, or we can see it as something positive, but it's going to happen either way, right? And regardless of any particular situation, we're all going to experience a good amount of bad luck throughout our lives, because that's simply part and parcel of a normal life, right? Not everything is always going to go our way. So Seneca thinks we ought to see difficult situations, negative situations, as something that will benefit us. At the very least, it will benefit us in the sense that it will make us better prepared for dealing with similar sorts of situations when they occur in the future. So again, even if you respond very badly to a difficult situation and you're knocked sideways emotionally, when you encounter that same situation the next time, it's not going to hit you quite so bad. You've had that first initial shock. So even in that small way, you're going to benefit from having experienced a bad luck. Okay, so if you see bad luck as a source of misery, Seneca and the other Stoics are going to argue that's simply your choice. You've chosen, in effect, to make yourself miserable. And that's the real misfortune, right? To suffer psychologically through your own choice is the real misfortune that people put themselves through. Getting sick or ill, for instance, that's not a misfortune. That's just part and parcel of a normal human life. We're all going to get sick from time to time. That's just part of being a human being. But bewailing your illness as something cruel and unfair and unjust, that's just a self-inflicted wound that you add on top of the illness, right? And that's the thing that Seneca thinks we can avoid. Of course, none of us can avoid getting ill from time to time. That's just something that we all will inevitably experience. Seneca thinks that suffering through difficult situations, experiencing bad luck, is also a really valuable opportunity for developing self-knowledge. And self-knowledge is one of the things that the Stoics, following Socrates, think is absolutely fundamental if we want to live a good life. So when we find ourselves in really difficult, trying situations and circumstances, when we're being put to the test, Seneca argues that that's when we find out who we really are, right? Will we cowardly hide away, or will we step up and help out? How do we know unless we're faced with a difficult situation that forces us to make that choice? So we gain self-knowledge by being tested by difficult circumstances. And that's a genuinely positive thing, right? You might learn that you're not the sort of courageous person that's destined to go off and become a firefighter or some other very challenging job like that, right? And that might be a very useful piece of self-knowledge to have. Equally, you might think that you might come to realize where your strengths and weaknesses are, and that might help you focus on which virtues you might want to try and improve and develop in the future. Okay, and so for these reasons, Seneca wants to flip our usual thinking about good and bad luck on its head. So usually we think that good luck is something that benefits us when things go our way. and bad luck is something that harms us. Seneca wants to argue in the reverse. It's what we ordinarily think of as bad luck that in fact benefits us, because that tests us, gives us the opportunity to gain this self-knowledge, enables us to develop our virtues, those excellent character traits that we saw earlier are the one thing we really need in order to live a good life, right? When we experience what we ordinarily think of as good luck, that often harms us because it makes us lazy and complacent and ungrateful for the things we have, right? There's nothing, Seneca says, that's worse than unending wealth and luxury and good fortune, right? You just become fat and lazy, you overeat, you sit around all day in comfort, you develop all sorts of vices, both physical and psychological. You don't benefit from an extended period of good luck, right? It's bad luck that enables us really to grow. Now, there's a lot of rhetoric going on here, right? Seneca's deliberately painting an extreme picture. He's the master of rhetoric. He's a fantastic writer. So you might not want to take what he's saying completely literally. He's trying to really push the point. But what he's certainly doing at the very least is challenging or counterbalancing our usual ways of thinking about bad luck and challenging our usual assumption that bad luck is something that we ought to want to avoid because it's something negative. We might not want to go so far as to accepting his conclusion that bad luck is the only good thing and we should run away from good luck, right? That's kind of slightly extreme view. But if we can at least get to a position where we can see that whether we experience good luck or bad luck, we're going to benefit in some way and we're going to suffer in some way. And so ultimately, it doesn't really matter which one you end up experiencing because you can see the benefits and the costs of both. Now, all this is in sharp contrast to the idea of hope. It doesn't try to desire any particular future. And I take it the idea of hope is a desire for a particular future, a particular outcome. Instead, the attitude that Seneca is trying to develop or trying to encourage us to develop is an attitude of seeing how we can benefit from whatever happens, learn from difficult times, be all the more grateful for positive experiences. Okay. Let me say a little bit about something from Epictetus as well, continuing this topic. We might wonder, and lots of critics have wondered, how realistic this Stoic attitude is in particularly extreme cases. What about bereavement, for instance, right? One of the most difficult situations that any of us might have to experience. And Epictetus talks about this. He talks about this quite a lot. He talks about a case where someone loses a child or loses a relative, and at first glance, he seems fairly dismissively to say, well, there's no reason to get excessively upset about this. And a number of critics of Stoicism have attacked Epictetus for being particularly unfeeling and uncaring when he makes these remarks. And indeed, quite a lot of people who are very sympathetic to Stoicism and drawn to it find this to be their kind of limit as to how far they're prepared to accept Stoicism, right? When Epictetus says, well, there's no need to be upset at the death of your child, for instance, some people say, well, wait a minute, that's perhaps going a bit too far. There's a limit to how much of this I can be prepared to accept. Now, rather than dismiss that thought as unfeeling or just backing off from it because we think this is a difficult subject, and of course it is a difficult subject, I think we need to confront it head on. What's Epictetus doing when he makes these remarks? Well, he's reminding us that this is something that's inevitable. One fact that we all need to come to terms with is that all of our relatives will at some point die. Similarly, we shall all at some point have to bury our parents, as difficult as that might be. But I expect Epictetus would say, what's the alternative? Well, there's only one logical alternative, and that's that they bury us. And that's a much worse outcome for everyone involved, right? Because it goes without saying, there's nothing worse than a parent having to bury their child. So, having to bury our parents is a natural, inevitable part of life. It's something that, if we are fortunate, we will all have to do, because as I've just said, the only alternative is far less pleasant. So, as perverse as this might sound, let's all hope that we get the opportunity to bury our parents. And this is something that we all ought to mentally prepare for, because it's something, hopefully, we will all have to do. And of course, reflecting on this in advance can help us to mentally prepare for it when it happens. And this isn't pessimistically assuming the worst, because we're talking about something that must happen at some point. We're not assuming a bad outcome. We're simply reflecting on something that is inevitable and is just a normal, natural part of a human life. And like Seneca, there's little space for hope here. There's no interest in thinking positively about the future. Instead, it's about understanding the world that we actually live in, working out how best to cope with the inevitable events that we're likely to experience. As Seneca reminds us, no matter how bad things might seem at some point, it's always possible for them to get worse. And if that's the case, there's always something to be grateful for, no matter how bad things might seem at any particular point. Now, for Seneca and Epictetus and the Stoics more widely, part of all of this involves reflecting on our place within nature. So, we're biological creatures. We're born, we grow up, we get old, we get sick from time to time, and eventually we die. That's just what biological creatures do. Generations come and go throughout history, and we are just a part of another one of those generations. We'll have our moment and we'll soon be forgotten. And there's no point trying to hope for anything other than that, because that's just how it is. Okay. Now, the Stoics were, of course, famous for rejecting negative emotions. And on their account, emotions, negative emotions in particular, are the product of how we think about things, how we think about particular situations, the judgments that we make about situations. So, for example, the emotion of fear would be produced by the belief that something bad was going to happen in the future. And the Stoics are going to say that that's a false belief, because nothing genuinely bad is going to happen in the future, because no external event, no adverse situation can damage our character. As Seneca argued, as we saw earlier, an adverse situation in the future might actually enable us to improve our character and so benefit. So as a consequence, there's no rational foundation for fear about any event in the future. And similarly, hope would be an emotion produced by the belief that something good might happen in the future. And for the same reason, they'd argue that this is also a negative emotion based on a false belief, the belief that something good might happen in the future. And that's going to be harmful for us too, just as fear is. Because if we hope for some particular outcome in the future and it doesn't come about, then of course we'll experience frustration and disappointment. So, like fear, hope is also something that is best avoided. Okay, so let me start to wrap things up. So rather than hope for some change in external circumstances in the future, the Stoics are going to argue that what we ought to focus our energies and attention on is what we can change right now. And what we can change right now is our own character. We can put into practice, we can put to work practices and techniques that will enable us to develop those virtuous character traits. And developing our character will enable us to cope better with whatever happens in the future, whether good or bad. And of course, whatever does happen to us in the future is ultimately out of our control. If we base our happiness on hoping for something that's ultimately out of our control, then what we are effectively doing is putting our happiness into the hands of fortune. And that, of course, will make our happiness extremely vulnerable. The Stoic view is that instead, we ought to take back control of our happiness and well-being and not make it dependent on anything else. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. So, people who are ready for questions can raise their hand, of course. In the meantime, I'll focus on a question by Steen in the chat. So this goes as follows, John. Steen asks, is there bad luck that according to Seneca is too bad to be a benefit, something you wouldn't want to experience to gain any benefits upon?
Well, I mean, I guess the one thing from which you definitely can't benefit is if you get killed, right? So that's the end of the show. So I guess that's the limit case. But beyond that, I mean, Seneca uses some pretty graphic imagery. He talks about soldiers in battle being hurt. He talks about boxers and wrestlers fighting. He talks about people being cauterized in surgery. So he's talking about pretty extreme, he has pretty extreme examples and analogies that he's using. So no, I don't think he'd want to suggest that there's anything that we can't benefit from.
Okay, thank you. A second question that Sten is asking is, how about hope derived from modern science? How do modern Stoics address this kind of hope? For instance, in Sten's case, medical technology saved his worthwhile life, and he can hope for a benefit that lasts longer than ever before. So what are your thoughts on putting hope on modern science?
Yeah, I mean, well, obviously, we've all benefited enormously from modern science in all sorts of ways, but it's not as if there's a smooth process of progression, right? There are fits and starts. Sometimes things go wrong. You know, some vaccines are incredibly helpful and really positive. Other medicines sometimes have side effects that have negative consequences that people haven't predicted. You don't really know until it happens, right? So you can place all your hope in something, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's always going to work out for the best.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to pick another one. Kathleen is asking, what's a virtuous character then, if it's so essential? Could you give your personal view on the virtuous character?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the Stoics talk about a number of sort of traditional virtues. So they talk about courage and moderation and justice. I mean, justice sounds like a slightly fancy word. I mean, I think I prefer, if we just say fairness, right? Fairness seems like a good way of thinking about that. Those are kind of traditional virtues. And then combined with that, the Stoics are going to want to insist on rationality being absolutely key. And they closely connect rationality with a sense of kind of calmness, right? So to be rational is to think things through carefully rather than reacting emotionally quickly. So that's going to be a really important character trait they're going to want to insist on. And also they want to insist that we're social beings, we're social animals. So having that kind of social instinct is going to be another really important character trait that they think that we all ought to cultivate. And we ought to remind ourselves that we're social beings and that we're all part of a single community, and we ought to be looking out for each other. And that's something that really important that we want to develop as well. So those, I think, are probably the core ones to hold on to.
Thank you, John. Marianne is asking an interesting question in the chat box. She said, somebody said to her, but character is set. So you are born with a certain character and you cannot change it. So how does one respond to that from a Stoic point of view?
Yeah, I guess we all have certain personality traits, right? And I take it that many of those personality traits are not things that we've chosen. There are all sorts of things about ourselves we can't change. So I think the Stoics would accept that. And in fact, Cicero talks about this. He talks about us paying attention to our unique individual natures, right? Not trying to be something that we're not. So I think the Stoics would acknowledge that kind of idea, that we have a kind of individual personality that is just there and may be there from the beginning. But when they're talking about character, what they're really talking about is patterns of acting, patterns of behavior. So when they're talking about changing your character, they're talking about changing the habitual way in which you react to things, right? And I think, and hopefully, a number of us can think of examples where we might have developed, better habits over time, as we've grown up and developed. And something like, say, various forms of cognitive behavioral therapy train people to overcome certain bad habitual ways of thinking and develop new positive ways of thinking. That's the sort of thing that they've got in mind when they're talking about developing character. So it's not the idea that we're this kind of blank sheet and you can just rewrite yourself into something completely new.
Thank you for your elaborate answer, John. Maybe a final one, a quick one. We still have 1 minute left. So the question goes as follows, John. Do the virtues Stoics refer to have a particular and absolute form? So is it necessary to presuppose particular ethics or some kind of psychological insights? Or can Stoic principles just be used relative to a contingent set of goals, certain frames of reference, or some kind of ethics?
Yeah, this might be a slightly tangential answer to that question, but there are no real rules in Stoic ethics. So there are no kind of commandments that say, this is always the right thing to do, or this is always how you ought to behave in a particular situation. So they think that one of the reasons why it's important to develop these character traits like fairness or moderation or whatever, is that those are the things that enable you to assess what to do in any specific situation that you find yourself in. And every situation is going to be unique. Every situation you're going to have to assess, right? So, for instance, you might think of the kind of universal moral commandment, thou shalt not kill, right? Now, the Stoics aren't going to subscribe to that, because there might be situations where, in fact, you ought to kill someone, right? And again, Cicero talks about the example, you face the tyrant and you have the opportunity to kill the tyrant for the benefit of wider humankind. So you ought to kill the tyrant, right? So a universal law saying never kill, the Stoics will say, no, there may well be circumstances when that's the right thing to do for the benefit of humankind as a whole. And it's that idea of what will benefit humankind as a whole is one of the kind of criteria that you use to help decide what to do in a given situation. So that, that's not a direct answer to the question, but it kind of touches on it.